The first note of the Welsh air vanished beneath Lady Maribel's laughter. Clara Hartwell kept her fingers upon the harp. The drawing room of Ashcombe House glowed with late afternoon gold. Beeswax candles warmed the gilded mirrors. Hothouse lilies sweetened the air almost to suffocation. And three sisters stood arranged before the Duke of Ravensmere like portraits waiting to be purchased. Maribel wore ivory silk embroidered with seed pearls. Arabella stood in blush pink, one gloved hand resting upon the pianoforte. Florence, the youngest, had been placed nearest the window, where sunlight turned her lavender gown almost silver. Clara wore pale blue that had been altered twice from one of Maribel's old dresses. She sat behind the harp because Aunt Ashcombe had ordered music soft enough not to interfere with the presentation of her daughters. "Do continue, Clara," Maribel said behind her fan. "The melancholy is so suitable. One almost expects rain indoors." Arabella hid a smile. Florence looked down. Clara played the next measure. The gut strings pressed against the calluses on her fingertips. The pain was familiar and clean. Unlike society, a harp did not punish sincerity. It answered the hand it was given. Aunt Ashcombe moved between her daughters with the precision of a general. "Your Grace, Maribel has studied Italian songs since childhood. Arabella is admired for her watercolour landscapes. Florence has the sweetest disposition in London." The Duke said nothing. Adrian, Duke of Ravensmere, sat slightly apart from the circle of admirers. His black coat and severe white cravat made the surrounding pastels look frivolous. Society called him the Silent Duke, though he was not mute. 5 years earlier, his former betrothed had stolen family jewels and estate papers before attempting to flee with another man. Since then, he had used words sparingly and trusted written evidence more than polished declarations. Clara knew why he had accepted Aunt Ashcombe's invitation. The proposed settlement for Maribel included a demand that Ravensmere absorb the private debts of Ashcombe House. Lord Julian Mercer, the Duke's oldest friend, had quietly warned him that the accounts did not balance. Adrian had come to inspect the family before he inspected the settlement. Clara also knew why her aunt needed the marriage. Aunt Ashcombe controlled Clara's lodging, her modest maternal allowance, and the character reference without which no respectable household would employ her. One refusal could leave Clara without income, protection, or a door willing to open. For 6 months, her aunt had threatened to send her to Yorkshire as an unpaid companion to an elderly relation. The post came with no wages and no promise of return. That letter already waited, sealed, in Aunt Ashcombe's writing desk. Maribel had mentioned the Yorkshire moors twice that week. The warning was clear. Play softly, pour tea, do not become visible. Clara reached the final chord and let it ring through the room. The whispering continued. "So simple," Maribel murmured. "Poor Clara has never mastered the dramatic pieces." The Duke did not laugh. Clara saw his gaze move from Maribel's smile to the harp strings, then to Clara's hands. His expression remained still, but the room's mockery seemed to strike something colder than indifference in him. She rose before the silence could become another performance. Her duty at the harp had ended. Her duty at the tea table had begun. The silver service waited near the windows. Clara crossed the carpet, aligned the cups, and lifted the porcelain pot. The handle was warm against her palm. She poured without spilling, though Maribel's laughter still clung to the room like smoke. Aunt Ashcombe began describing Maribel's accomplishments in estate hospitality. Clara nearly dropped the sugar tongs. Maribel had once ordered 36 lemons for a dinner requiring 12, and blamed the kitchen maid when the bill arrived. Arabella could not distinguish a rent roll from a menu. Florence tried, but Aunt Ashcombe allowed her to learn only what made a young woman decorative. The Duke's boots crossed the Persian rug. Conversation faltered. Adrian passed Maribel, Arabella, and Florence without stopping. He came to the tea table and stood before Clara. "Miss Hartwell." His voice was low and rough, as if each word had first been examined for dishonesty. "Your Grace. Tea, if you please." Maribel approached at once. "Your Grace." Clara need not trouble herself. "A footman can—" I asked Miss Hartwell. Nothing in his tone was rude. Nothing permitted argument. Clara poured. "Sugar?" "None." She placed the cup upon its saucer. The Duke looked toward the harp. That was a Welsh air. "Yes. Played without ornament. It does not require ornament." His gaze returned to her. "No, it does not." Maribel's fan snapped shut. Clara handed him the cup without touching his fingers. He accepted it, then remained beside the tea table, not shielding her with possession, simply occupying the space from which others had expected to move her. For the first time that afternoon, no one laughed behind Clara's back. Adrian took one sip. "Bitter," he said. "I can add sugar." I meant it as praise. A smile threatened Clara's composure. She lowered her eyes to the silver. Lord Julian appeared near the Duke's shoulder. He was a fair-haired gentleman with an easy expression and the alert gaze of a man who missed very little. "Ravensmere," he said. "Lady Maribel is waiting to explain the emotional necessity of Italian opera." Adrian looked at Clara's tea, then at Maribel. "I have already heard an honest piece of music." Lord Julian coughed into his glove. Clara suspected he was hiding laughter. Adrian set the cup upon the table. Before leaving, he drew a small card from his coat and wrote one sentence. He placed it beside the sugar bowl. "Bring the household ledgers to the library tomorrow. Lord Julian and Mrs. Finch will attend." Clara looked up. The mention of witnesses mattered. He knew what repeated private meetings could do to a dependent woman's name. Aunt Ashcombe saw the card and went pale. That night, Clara found the first proof that her aunt had expected the Duke to sign blindly. The proposed marriage settlement lay beneath a stack of invitations in the morning room. It named Maribel as bride, granted Aunt Ashcombe a generous jointure, and required Ravensmere to assume every debt connected to Ashcombe House, including several accounts Clara had never seen. The sums were too large. The dates were wrong. One charge for Maribel's Paris gowns had been entered as repairs to the tenant cottages. Another payment, supposedly made to Clara from her maternal allowance, had never reached her hands. Clara copied the figures before replacing the document. She slept badly. The library door stood open the next morning. Mrs. Finch, the Ashcombe housekeeper, sat near the window with her mending. Lord Julian occupied a chair beside the cold hearth. Adrian stood at the long table, where 3 account books waited beside a legal pad and an untouched cup of tea. Clara entered carrying her own blue-marked ledger. The Duke rose. So did Lord Julian. Mrs. Finch gave Clara a reassuring nod. "Your Grace asked for the household books," Clara said. "And your opinion?" Adrian replied. Aunt Ashcombe had told her he requested no such thing. Clara laid down the ledgers. Adrian indicated the chair opposite him. She sat only after Mrs. Finch moved closer to the fire, making the arrangement visibly proper to anyone passing in the hall. Lord Julian unfolded the proposed settlement. Lady Ashcombe wishes Ravensmere to absorb £7,000 in debt upon marriage, he said. The house itself is not worth that sum. It is not 7,000, Clara answered. Not lawfully. Adrian's gaze sharpened. She opened her ledger. The original bond was £4,000. The coal charge appears twice. The Mayfair dressmaker has been entered under household textiles and again under Maribel's personal account. This payment, marked as my maternal allowance, was never delivered. Lord Julian leaned forward. How much is owed to you? £200 over 4 years. Mrs. Finch's needle stopped. Adrian did not speak at once. Clara saw his jaw tighten as he compared the columns. Did Lady Ashcombe control the allowance? He asked. Yes. And your character reference? Yes. And the Yorkshire position? Clara looked at him. He knew. Lord Julian answered the question in her face. Maribel mentioned it at Lady Sefton's last night. She said the Moors would cure you of ambition. The second clue. The plan was not a private family arrangement. It was already being used as social punishment. Adrian moved to the grate. The fire had collapsed into grey ash. He added 2 logs, opened the vent, and waited until flame took hold before returning to the table. Warmth first, then work. He placed the settlement before Clara. Will you show us every false entry? Not command. Permission. Clara drew the ledger closer. For 3 hours, they reduced Lady Ashcombe's triumph to arithmetic. Mrs. Finch verified household purchases. Lord Julian copied dates and names. Clara traced duplicated charges through 4 books. Adrian asked short, exact questions and wrote only after she answered. When Clara's fingers stiffened, he moved the inkstand nearer the hearth. Mrs. Finch brought bread and hot tea. Adrian's cup remained without sugar. Clara took hers with 1 small spoon because she had skipped breakfast and needed strength more than pride. At noon, they had isolated nearly £2,000 in duplicated or unauthorized debt, not erased, not magically gone, disputed, with dates, originals requested, and enough evidence to ask the trustees for time. Adrian closed the settlement. I will not sign this. Clara's relief came so sharply that she gripped the chair beneath the table. Not because Maribel had lost a duke, because Clara had not lost £200 and 4 years of her life beneath someone else's signature. Lord Julian gathered the copies. I shall lodge these with Ravensmere's solicitor. If Lady Ashcombe attempts to move money or remove Miss Hartwell before the accounts are examined, there will be a written trail. Adrian looked toward Clara. Would you accept a separate reference from Mrs. Finch and Lord Julian? Her breath caught. A character reference independent of Aunt Ashcombe would mean employment, choice, a door not controlled by the woman who threatened Yorkshire. Yes, and if you decide to leave Ashcombe House before the investigation is complete, Ravensmere will fund a room at Mrs. Linton's respectable boarding house for 6 months. No service required. No obligation to me. The room went very still. Third option. Not Yorkshire. Not dependence. Not marriage. Clara looked down at her ink-stained fingers. You would do that before knowing whether every charge can be proved. I know the allowance entry is false. Mrs. Finch confirms you were never paid. That is enough to protect your immediate choice. Mrs. Finch set down her mending. And I will write the reference today. Clara swallowed. Thank you. Adrian inclined his head, as if gratitude were unnecessary between people correcting an account. The second act of kindness arrived in a wooden case. 2 days later, Clara entered the music room and found a new harp string laid beside the instrument. The old one had begun to fray near the soundboard. She had planned to mend it with wax and hope. A card rested beneath the coil. For whatever music you choose to play next. No signature. None was needed. Florence stood near the open door, twisting her hands. I told Lord Julian the string was failing. She confessed. I hope you are not angry. Clara touched the smooth coil. No. Florence stepped closer. Maribel says you are trapping the Duke. Do you believe her? Florence looked toward the corridor. I believe Maribel is afraid he listens when you speak. It was the first honest sentence Florence had ever offered her. Clara replaced the string herself. That evening, she played the Welsh air again. Not for the drawing room, for herself. A week passed. Adrian's visits remained proper. Mrs. Finch or Lord Julian was always present. If Clara worked in the library, the door stayed open. If she tuned the harp, Adrian listened from the far side of the room, while Lord Julian pretended to read the newspaper. Their closeness grew through work rather than declaration. A question in a ledger margin. A cup of tea placed where her elbow would not strike it. A curtain drawn when afternoon glare made the music difficult to read. Once, during a sudden rain, Clara discovered Adrian had ordered the carriage to remain not for her, but for Mrs. Finch, who otherwise would have walked home after dark. He had noticed that Clara worried whenever the housekeeper left in bad weather. He never announced such acts. That was why Clara trusted them. Maribel noticed too. The attack began at Lady Sefton's musical. Clara had attended as Aunt Ashcombe's companion, seated behind the family near the wall. Maribel performed an Italian aria with great volume and perfect emptiness. When she finished, applause rose politely. Then Lady Sefton asked Clara whether she might favour the room with the Welsh air everyone had begun discussing. Clara knew whose doing that was. Lord Julian stood near the mantel, examining the ceiling with suspicious innocence. Aunt Ashcombe's fingers closed around Clara's wrist beneath the folds of her shawl. Decline, she whispered. Clara looked at the harp, then at Adrian, standing across the room. He did not nod. He did not command. He simply waited. Clara rose. She played the Welsh air without ornament. This time, the room listened. The melody moved through the candlelit salon like rain over distant hills. No aggressive trills, no theatrical pauses, only restraint, grief, and the quiet persistence of something refusing to disappear. When the final note faded, Lady Sefton's eyes were wet. The applause began slowly, then deepened. Maribel did not clap. On the carriage ride home, Aunt Ashcombe said nothing until the lamps of Grosvenor Square vanished behind them. Then she spoke. You leave for Yorkshire after the ball. Florence gasped. Arabella stared at her gloves. Clara's pulse steadied rather than raced. Mrs. Finch and Lord Julian have provided me with references. Aunt Ashcombe's face changed. And I have accommodation available elsewhere. You ungrateful girl. You withheld my allowance. Silence struck the carriage harder than thunder. Maribel leaned forward. You have been searching private accounts? I have been reading entries made in my name. Aunt Ashcombe's voice became dangerously calm. Your allowance paid for your keep. No document authorizes that. You own nothing. You have no father, no husband, no position. You remain in my house because I permit it. Clara looked through the dark window at London passing in wet reflections. Then I shall not remain. The decision frightened her. It also made breathing easier. Aunt Ashcombe moved first. By morning. Clara's trunk had been taken from her chamber and locked in the east storeroom. Mrs. Finch's reference vanished from the writing desk. A letter was sent to Yorkshire claiming Clara had accepted the unpaid post willingly. Two constraints closed at once: physical control of her possessions and reputational control of her name. But Aunt Ashcombe had forgotten Florence. At dawn, the youngest sister slipped into Clara's room with the storeroom key and the intercepted Yorkshire letter. "She meant to send this before you could answer," Florence whispered. "Maribel told her the Duke would forget you once you were gone." Clara read the letter. It described her as unstable, ungrateful, and in need of strict supervision. The lies had dates. The lies had signatures. Clara folded the letter. "Will you testify that you found it?" Florence went pale. Then she nodded. "Yes." That afternoon, Lord Julian arrived with Adrian. Aunt Ashcombe met them in the drawing room and announced that Clara was indisposed. Clara entered before the lie could settle. She wore her pale blue gown and carried the Yorkshire letter. "Mrs." Finch followed with a duplicate of the missing reference. Florence came behind them, trembling but present. Adrian remained near the open door. He did not cross the room until Clara chose to approach. Lord Julian placed a club register and a sealed statement on the table. "Lady Maribel has also spread word that Ravensmere wagered he could make the overlooked cousin believe herself desired," he said. "The register shows no such wager. 3 gentlemen have signed that the rumour began with Maribel." Maribel's face drained. Adrian looked at Clara. "I promised you a choice, independent of this house," he said. "Mrs. Linton's rooms are ready. Your allowance dispute has been placed with my solicitor. Whether you ever speak to me again, those arrangements remain. A kept promise, not romance used as rescue." Clara held the Yorkshire letter against her palm. "Thank you." Aunt Ashcombe rose. "This is an outrage. She is under my authority, not over funds legally settled to Clara's mother," Lord Julian said, "and not over her movements at 24. Clara turned to her aunt. "I will leave after the ball." Aunt Ashcombe blinked. "Why attend at all?" "Because you have already told society I am being sent away in disgrace. I will not disappear and allow you to choose the reason." Maribel's mouth tightened. "What do you mean to do?" Clara looked toward the music room. "Play." The Ashcombe ball filled the house with 1,000 candles and twice as many opinions. The ballroom smelled of roses, hot wax, and summer rain gathering beyond the open terrace doors. Clara wore a simple grey silk gown. She had refused Florence's offer of lavender ribbons. She carried no jewels except her mother's small silver brooch, newly recovered from the locked trunk. Her possessions waited at Mrs. Linton's boarding house. Her reference rested with Lord Julian. Her future no longer depended upon what happened tonight. That freedom changed the way she entered the room. Maribel performed before supper. She chose the same Italian aria she had sung at Lady Sefton's and commanded Clara to accompany her at the pianoforte. Clara took her seat. The guests continued talking through the introduction. Maribel began loudly. Then, halfway through the first verse, she stopped. "Clara is deliberately playing too softly," she announced. "She has resented every kindness shown to her and now means to ruin my performance before she runs away with the Duke's protection." The room quieted. There it was, the public accusation. Aunt Ashcombe stood near the front, pale but silent. Arabella stared at the floor. Florence took one step toward Clara, then stopped as if waiting to be brave enough. Clara lifted her hands from the keys. She did not look for Adrian. "Not yet. I am leaving Ashcombe House. she said, but not because His grace commands it, and not because I have accepted marriage. A stir passed through the ballroom. Clara rose from the pianoforte. I am leaving because Lady Ashcombe withheld my maternal allowance, controlled my reference, and attempted to send me to Yorkshire under a letter describing me as unstable and ungrateful. Florence crossed the room. Her face was white, but her hand did not shake when she placed the letter upon the pianoforte. I found it in Aunt's desk, she said. I saw her seal it. Lord Julian stepped forward with Mrs. Finch's duplicate reference and the club statements. The rumour of a wager is also false, he said. Lady Maribel began it after Ravensmere declined to sign the proposed settlement. Maribel's lips parted. Aunt Ashcombe whispered, Florence, come away. Florence remained beside Clara. Arabella came next. I heard Maribel tell Aunt that Yorkshire would make the Duke return to her, she said, barely above a whisper. I said nothing. I should have. The three sisters were no longer arranged as brides. They stood as witnesses. Adrian entered from the terrace with his solicitor and one of the trustees named in Clara's maternal settlement. He had waited outside the centre of the room until Clara finished speaking. The solicitor opened a narrow case. The late Mrs. Hartwell's settlement provides Miss Clara Hartwell with £50 annually, payable without deduction for maintenance after her 21st year. £200 remain unpaid. Lady Ashcombe has agreed to restore the principal through a supervised account. Aunt Ashcombe's fan trembled. I agreed to no such thing. The trustee produced the copied ledger entries. Then the matter may be placed before Chancery. The records are clear. Aunt Ashcombe sat down. Maribel looked around the ballroom for support and found only curiosity stripped of admiration. Clara turned to the harp at the edge of the dais. The new string gleamed faintly among the old ones. She crossed the room. No aunt ordered her. No cousin sneered permission. Clara sat and placed her fingers upon the strings. This is the Welsh air Lady Maribel called a funeral piece, she said. Tonight I shall play it because I choose it. The first note settled over the ballroom. Every conversation stopped. The music rose quietly, without apology. Clara played not as background, not as a dependent earning her supper, but as an artist who understood that restraint could hold more truth than spectacle. When she finished, no one spoke for a long moment. Then applause filled the room. Not polite applause. Listening made visible. Clara stood. Adrian waited at the foot of the dais. He opened his hand, palm upward. Clara did not take it yet. Facing the ballroom, she said, I will speak with His Grace because I choose to hear what he asks. No person in this house sends me. Only then did she place her hand in his. He led her not through the ballroom as a possession, but to the open terrace, where Lord Julian and Florence remained within sight through the glass doors. Rain scented the night air. Jasmine climbed the stone balustrade. Adrian stopped at a respectful distance. You have independent rooms, restored income, and references whether you refuse me or never see me again, he said. I know. I will not ask you to become Duchess tonight. Clara's heart struck once against her ribs. What will you ask? Permission to court you. Nothing more. No command. No exchange of safety for affection. He continued, My solicitor has drafted no marriage settlement because you have not agreed to one. If you ever do, you will read every line, amend every term, and retain your income and musical work independently of me. Clara looked back through the glass. Florence stood beside the harp. Arabella spoke quietly with Mrs. Finch. Maribel had left the dais. Aunt Ashcombe sat surrounded by the consequences of ink. Clara turned to Adrian. You once said my music required no sweetening. It does not. And if I tell you the truth when it displeases you, I shall listen before I answer. And if Ravensmere's accounts contain false entries, you will cross them out. The corner of her mouth lifted. Then you may court me. He bowed over her offered hand and pressed one brief, respectful kiss to her knuckles. Inside, Lord Julian applauded once. Florence covered a laugh. The practical world followed the next morning. In the Ashcombe Library, before the trustee, Adrian's solicitor, Lord Julian, Mrs. Finch, Florence, and Arabella. Clara read 3 documents line by line. The first restored her unpaid allowance into an independent account. The second released her from every unpaid companion arrangement made without her written consent and secured a permanent character reference from Mrs. Finch and Lord Julian. The third was not a marriage settlement. It was an offer of paid work cataloguing the Ravensmere Music Library and estate archives for 1 year, with rooms of her own choosing and the right to leave at any time. Clara amended the salary upward by £10. Lord Julian choked on his tea. Adrian read the change. Reasonable, he said. Aunt Ashcombe signed the financial acknowledgement under the trustee's supervision. She retained her own household, but lost authority over Clara's funds and correspondence. Maribel was required to retract the wager rumour in writing to every hostess who had received it. Arabella and Florence placed their names beneath Clara's statement as witnesses. No one was ruined beyond repair. No one escaped consequence. 3 months later, the Ravensmere Library glowed with autumn light. Clara stood beside a long table covered with estate ledgers, music catalogues, and newly copied scores. The Welsh air rested open upon the harp near the window. Beside it stood a silver tea service. Adrian entered after knocking. May I? You may. He crossed to the table and looked at the 2 cups. His was dark, without sugar. Clara's held 1 small spoon of honey. You have sweetened yours, he observed. I no longer have to ration it. The words quieted him. He placed a folded settlement draft beside the ledger. Clara did not open it immediately. Are you asking? Yes. She read every page. Independent income retained. Music work protected. No control over her maternal funds. A clause establishing scholarships for dependent young women with musical ability. A separate office in the Ravensmere archives. Clara added 1 sentence in her own hand. The Duchess of Ravensmere may choose the music played in her own drawing room. Adrian read it gravely. Essential. Lord Julian, serving as witness, muttered, The estate may never recover. Clara laughed. Only after every amendment was entered did she sign. She set down the pen. Then she crossed the library of her own accord and stood before Adrian. You may ask me again. He offered his hand. Clara Hartwell. Will you choose Ravensmere and me? Clara placed her fingers in his. I choose both, but the harp remains properly tuned. Especially then. He bowed over her hand and kissed her knuckles once. By winter, the great drawing room at Ravensmere no longer felt like a room built for performance. The harp stood near the fire. The silver tea service rested beside Clara's ledgers. Florence visited to study music. Arabella helped administer the scholarship fund. Lord Julian complained that every invitation now required him to listen sincerely. And when Clara played the Welsh air, the room fell quiet because it wished to hear. She had once learned to play softly so others might shine. At Ravensmere, she chose the music, and the room learned to listen. The end. Outro. Stay a little longer beside the fire. Where Clara's harp rests beside the silver tea service, and the kettle has just begun to sing. Which moment stayed with you most? The Duke refusing to laugh while she played, Clara choosing the Welsh air before the whole ballroom, or the moment she made him ask again after every freedom was secured. Quiet truth does not need to become louder. It only needs a room willing to listen. Share your thoughts below and subscribe. The kettle is always on.